Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. This has been a wonderful panel to put together. I'm joined with 4 very distinguished individuals who are here today to speak about LNG from very distinct perspectives. I'm joined by Eric Montague, who's the VP of JERA Americas, and I'm also joined with Rick Rocheleau, who's the director of Hawaii Natural Energy Institute. We have Representative Nicole Lowen with the state of Hawaii, District 7. And then I have Stephen Walls, who's the Deputy Energy Officer with the Hawaii State Energy Office. So today we'll be discussing LNG. And LNG has been debated in Hawaii for over 15 years. We've repeatedly resurfaced during moments of transition and uncertainty in the state's energy future. The discussion began in earnest back in 2000s and 2010 when Hawaii was confronting some of the highest electricity costs in the nation, as well as a heavy dependence on imported fossil fuel. Over the years, proposals have included LNG import terminals, fuel conversions at existing power plants, and broader concepts involving energy security on long-term grid reliability. Different administrations and stakeholders have viewed LNG in very different ways, some seeing it as a practical transition fuel that could support reliability and affordability, while others raised concern about the long-term fossil fuel dependence, stranded infrastructure, and compatibility with Hawaii's renewable energy goals. At the same time, Hawaii has adopted one of the most ambitious clean energy policies in the country with its 100% renewable portfolio standards, and continues to navigate major system changes, including the retirement of the coal generation on Oahu, rapid growth in distributed energy resources, increasing penetration of battery resources, and ongoing reliability and affordability challenges. Today's conversation takes place in a broader context, where the state continues to weigh questions of reliability, affordability, decarbonization, capital investment, and timing. We're fortunate to have a panel representing a range of perspectives today and expertise from across development, research, and policy. To begin the discussion, I'd like to have Eric Montague from JERA Americas help frame the current LNG proposal landscape and discuss how JERA views LNG within Hawaii's evolving energy transition. Eric, take it away.
Thanks, Jenny. Really appreciate being invited to be on the panel. When you said esteemed guests, I think you're talking about these first 3. I'm not sure I make that category here, but what I'd like to do today, there's a lot of questions about who is JERA and what are we doing here and how do we feel about LNG, and we're not going to be able to cover all of that today, but maybe I can lead off by sharing a little bit about our company, talk about why we think this is a solution that is a good fit here, and then talk a little bit about some of our views on why this makes a benefit and some of the challenges that come with it. So we've prepared a couple of slides. I'll walk through those. I think we've got Q&A at the end, so hopefully we have an opportunity to dive into a bit of dialogue on that. So JERA is one of those really big companies that no one's really ever heard of. It's a Japanese company. We just celebrated our 11th anniversary in April. JERA was formed by 2 large electric utilities in Japan after the Fukushima disaster and a little bit of restructuring of the energy sector. And so I tell people JERA is like a teenage company. It's not a startup, but it's still in the early years of its growth, although it was started with a very large balance sheet and a big portfolio and a lot of ambition. So JERA is well known for its natural gas power generation. We, in the last probably 20, 30 years, we've built over 30 gigawatts of natural gas power generation. Our global fleet is somewhere around 70 gigawatts of generation worldwide. We buy more liquid natural gas for our own consumption in power plants than anyone else. It's been one of the primary fuels that has kept the lights on in Japan for the last couple of decades, particularly after the shift away from nuclear. We have a renewable portfolio that is growing. I think we've got about 6 gigawatts operating today, and we've got developments kind of across the spectrum. I'll talk a little bit more about that. And I think one of the important things that we want people to understand about JERA is that we have a 2050 net zero goal that we are mandated to help the state or the country of Japan work to. So when we got involved in Hawaii and started looking at the challenges here, we realized there's a lot of the same types of issues that exist in Hawaii are the same things we're facing in Japan. Before we dive into that a bit more, on the renewable side, JERA, outside of our large gas power portfolio, we, I think, are one of the larger, maybe in the top 5 offshore wind producers globally. So we have a pretty diverse portfolio of wind around the world. We have onshore in the US, we have some solar, we have some wind. We also are doing a lot of work on future fuel development. So at our power plant, we operate a power plant outside of New York that I think produces about 20% of the power for the New York metro area. That power plant has been blending 40% hydrogen from a local hydrogen source for the last couple of years. And so we're doing a lot there in terms of trying to demonstrate viability of some of these future fuels. We also have an investment in a joint venture in Louisiana that we're quite excited about to produce blue ammonia, which we will be shipping in a few years down the road to Japan to displace coal in power plants there. So JERA, I think, comes into this discussion with a pretty broad and diverse range of perspectives. I will say that a lot of what we are doing is working, and some of the things that we're doing don't work so well. We've got a ventures group that is investing in all sorts of technologies. I don't know if they've invested anything with any of the companies here. We just announced a partnership with UC Berkeley with that group, and we've got kind of our hands in different things. Our approach on the ventures side comes back to that mission of basically providing energy for Japan in a way that is safe and responsible, and knowing that we have to stay on the front edge of what is available there. So when we, I'm going to skip forward here. When we look at the situation in Hawaii and recognizing that we are coming from the outside and we are new here and there's a lot to learn and there's a lot of people in this room that have a lot more experience here and perspective than we do. But we look at this, and this comes from Stephen's report here, which I think probably everyone in this room is familiar with. When we talk about LNG, it's really about trying to find a near-term practical way to displace oil. And I think sometimes this conversation gets a little bit confused of, well, if you're doing LNG, then you must not want to be doing renewables. And I think it's actually quite the opposite, and I think it's an important message we want people to hear from JERA. Today, 70% of the oil, more or less, in the state, of the energy in the state comes through oil-fired power. LNG is a very practical way to address that in the near term and also set the state up to meet some of its long-term goals. And we can talk about the pros and cons of LNG going forward. That is a true statement also with the statement that we believe that the renewables in this market need to accelerate at a pace of probably 3 or 4 times of how they're getting built out to meet the targets that the state has in 2045. And so I think this is not an either-or situation. I think, unfortunately, sometimes this argument gets boiled down to, well, if you're supporting LNG, then you're not supporting renewables. And I think it's quite the opposite, is that all of this stuff is going to be needed to get us to where we want to be here. In Hawaii, it's the same challenge that we're facing in Japan. And so we, in addition to thinking that, hey, instead of choosing oil today, there's a choice where you could be burning LNG, and if you don't want to be burning LNG, then there's not another viable option in today's market from a balancing reliability, cost, and sustainability that we can see that is not gas. Now, in the future, we hope that is a different choice, right? And we're working very hard on some of these different fuels that we think will be part of that baseload solution. But I think that is something, I think if nothing else, I'd want the audience here to understand that JERA's position of looking at an investment here and participating in this market is one to not only deal with the oil with a better solution, but also try and support and accelerate the renewable penetration here. we put a proposal forward to the state. I'm not going to go into a lot of that. It's been publicly put forward, and there's a lot of information in that proposal. I don't need to recap it here, but we are proposing a project, an LNG import facility, and a new power plant project in the Barbers Point area. There's, again, more detail provided in that in the further document there. We recently pre-filed for the FERC application for that LNG import facility. So there is being more information putting out on our plans on that, and that's something we'd be happy to talk about a bit more. And so in conscious of time here, one of the things I just wanted to kind of dive into, because LNG is a new subject here in Hawaii. I say new. LNG is the idea of LNG has been here for a long time, but the experience with LNG is quite limited here. And we see that there's maybe sometimes a lot of messages there that aren't based on the facts or the practical and empirical evidence that come from LNG as a fuel. And we as someone who buy a lot of LNG for our own consumption, are pretty comfortable with this, but we recognize that there's a lot of debate about some of these issues, as there should be, right? I think any one of these choices should come with a lot of debate. And so I think at the heart of it, LNG, looking at the historical pricing and what our view of the future pricing is an affordable option. From a safety standpoint, it's always interesting to see these kind of pictures of these manufactured fireballs to say this is what is going to happen if you bring LNG here, when in reality, because it is such a highly controlled and regulated industry, the safety track record for LNG, and particularly importation of LNG, is incredible compared to lots of other energy sources. The discussion we had earlier about how does LNG fit with renewables, we have seen very clearly in Japan our ability to run power plants in a more dynamic way has been really important as renewables have increased their share of electricity generation on the grid. And LNG can be an enabler, and we think quite an important enabler, to allow for that next tranche of renewable adoption. Many places that have adopted LNG, and you can look at countries in Europe, you can look at islands in the Caribbean, have seen significant renewable acceleration after the adoption of LNG. So I think that the data suggests that LNG is actually a very good complement to renewables. And I think lastly, there's this question about, well, if we go down and we spend money on LNG infrastructure, we're going to be locked in, and then we won't be able to make it to 2045. And I think that's a very valid concern with any major capital project. And what, fortunately, the configuration and the type of equipment and the type of installation required here keeps it quite fungible and allows it to be a very good transitional investment that opens the door for future fuels, but also is not, I would say, a monumental risk from a fossil fuel lock-in. So there's more we can talk about in all of these areas, and I think JERA is very happy to be here and part of the discussion. We're super excited about being part of the solution here, and look forward to this discussion here and further discussion going forward.
Great, thank you, Eric. Appreciate you presenting argument, or at least a perspective that helps us evaluate, LNG as a transitional fuel that hopefully will improve reliability, affordability for the state of Hawaii. So thank you. Next, I'd like to invite Stephen Walls with the Hawaii State Energy Office to make some comments. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I also will share the same sentiment. When you said distinguished guests, I think you meant these two and not me. But I'm really glad to be here and to be able to share a bit, and I'm looking forward to audience Q&A. I'm glad to have a really good dialogue around this subject. I think having a vigorous dialogue around how we're going to get to 2045 is fundamentally important to our success, and I welcome that. Because the clean energy transition is not inevitable. I think everybody here in this room knows that based on the discussion so far between the complaints and constraints of everything that's happening. We know it's not inevitable. It's going to take a lot of work. It's going to take talking through some really hard issues to make it happen. As a clean energy advocate in a former life, Sometimes it feels like you're on the right side of history, and it does feel inevitable. 2023 had some ups and downs, but it felt really good. I don't know if 2023 feels like a long time ago in clean energy, but 2020, it was great. You know, solar hardware has gotten so cheap from 2005. Computing power is really cheap, so we can reduce the balance of system costs and like make permitting go faster, in theory. LEDs are cheap and they're a really good product. EVs are a realistic option for many of us, not everybody at this point, but many of us. And they're a fantastic product. If you haven't test driven an EV, please go do. But there's nothing like an openly hostile federal government to clean energy to make you kind of do a reality check and makes it clear that we've got a lot of ground to cover. A lot of the progress that has been made on solar and LEDs and battery storage and EVs was through federal R&D and federal tax credits. Local policies helped that, like the state tax credit was really important for a number of projects to reach the finish line. But more importantly, a lot of people in this room worked really hard to get the market started, and that kind of cooperation is what makes 37%, give or take, renewable penetration possible. We're just not getting there fast enough. I think that was a major theme from yesterday, from what I've been told. Anyone watching stage 3 knows that it's not happening fast enough. If anyone has read the competitive bidding framework recently, they know speed is not a requirement. Stationary emissions are flat, unfortunately, since Friends was initially airing on TV. So despite 37% renewables, the carbon aspect of our power system isn't improving. And supply chains across the energy spectrum, whether clean or otherwise, are strained. There are bottlenecks in unfriendly countries, whether it's fuel or critical minerals or finished product, inhumane labor conditions, poor or non-existent at times environmental stewardship from people that we buy our energy from. So the honey-do list for the transition is really long. And if anybody wants to talk to me about that, I'd be happy to. We don't have time today. We will succeed, though, if we continue to work together. We know we can't keep doing the same thing and expect a different result. We will succeed in the transition if we work through important issues collaboratively and in good faith, if we don't let fear and uncertainty win the day, and if we don't lose the forests for the trees. And sometimes that's really easy. It's easy to get distracted these days with a blatant, explicit strategy to flood the zone and induce indifference and fatigue and defeatism in clean energy and climate action. It's easy to get distracted. And there's social pressure to feel relevant all the time, to have an opinion about everything, and to get clicks. And that's, that pressure isn't really all that healthy, but it's there. And then there's just all of that packaged together. There's so much uncertainty. It's almost inevitable that we start a war every few years, but it still feels like we don't know when it's coming. And it's with all of that, it's really easy to lose sight of what really matters. So I'm really glad Eric is here, because he was able to tell you and can tell you through this conversation and other conversations what they have in mind and what they can accomplish based on their expertise and their track record, what they think they can do to help Hawaii. In 2045, state law requires our power sector to be renewable. It requires the power sector to be renewable. State law also calls for the entire economy to be net zero by 2045. So we have a goal of decarbonization, or a state law requirement of sorts with no teeth, to be decarbonized by 2045, but we definitely must be renewable. And as a state official, I am obliged to work towards that, not just study, but actually work towards it, try to make some decisions and try to take some actions, because we know we have a lot to do, like renewable energy procurement, building code adoptions, resilience to natural hazards, all of that sort of stuff. Those are the things we need to be talking about. I'm glad to see a lot of that on the agenda for these 2 days. Because if we don't focus on key barriers to the transition, that's the biggest risk of failure. We have to stay focused on what really matters. We can't afford to be distracted away from the key issues, and we can't be paralyzed by uncertainty. We don't know exactly how we're going to reach 100% renewable by 2045 or be fully decarbonized by 2045. We never did. Let's not crash out over that uncertainty. Let's stay committed to progress. Let's reduce emissions where we can, reduce costs where we can, increase renewables because we're required to, and follow the law. If you're unsure about JERA's intentions, ask him. Eric's here. They've sponsored the event. Ask. Ask hard questions. Ask pointed questions. If you're concerned that they won't support our clean energy goals, ask. If you're worried about lobbying against the RPS, ask him to commit to that. Like today, he's here. Talk to him. We have a multinational corporation from Japan with a US presence who wants to invest in Hawaii. They want to reduce costs for Oahu ratepayers, others if possible, and reduce our carbon footprint. If we work together, we've got a real chance to ultimately eliminate our emissions in the power sector, which no one else really has a plan for. All I'm asking is that you all be open to this investment, hear them out. When there's a project proposed in the PUC, vet it in good faith. I'm sure we all want to see that happen. Let's have an actual discussion about policy guardrails that we need to see to ensure that this investment aligns with our values. I attended the US Climate Alliance annual meeting a couple weeks ago, and that's where the 2 dozen plus bipartisan coalition of state governor representatives get together and talk about climate action for the past year and the year ahead. And there's a lot of frustration about how clean energy and climate issues are being swept in, are under attack by the federal government. Like states' ability to do and take actions in climate and energy are under attack, active attack by the federal government, and that's making our job harder. Our 2045 targets are science-based. The United Nations climate scientists have said at what pace we need to eliminate carbon from our energy system. Our targets are science-based. In a way, they're optional, but at what cost? There was also a lot of frustration, and so the Climate Alliance remains committed to these science-based targets. There was also a lot of conversation about how clean energy and climate issues are being swept into the culture wars, which is sort of like an unforced error, I think. It just makes it harder for us to communicate openly and do work through challenging issues. It creates a hyper-polarized environment where dialogue becomes impossible and insults and mistrust become the norm, and it's just really corrosive. Any difference of opinion on certain topics leads to blanket judgments about people's character, their moral turpitude, and their integrity. And it's just really unhelpful. It leads to threats, personal and professional, and it fosters an unwillingness to cooperate, even when there's common ground. It's hard to work in an environment like that. I don't like it. One of the reasons I don't like it is because very little happens. The people that do agree and should be working together find it easy to avoid each other because they're aggravated about a stance on a particular issue. I don't think we can afford that. Because the list of things we have to do is really, really long. What fuel we stop using in 2045, I don't think should be the source of much controversy. That's my humble opinion. Anyway, we've got a lot to do. Hopefully we all work together. I look forward to questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Stephen. That was a great framing of your perspective, the State Energy Office's perspective on this issue. So I'd like to turn it over to Rick Rocheleau for an additional perspective on the economic and system level, considerations supporting around Hawaii's LNG energy transition. So thank you, Rick.
Thanks, Jenny, and thanks for the invitation to be here, and thanks, Eric and Steve, for your discussions. I'm going to apologize in advance for two things. One, for being an engineer and showing some numbers, and secondly, for looking at some of my notes here at the very beginning, because on my introduction, I'm going to go through a little bit of a timeline and kind of a little bit of discussions taking place over the last year, and try to redirect a little bit of that discussion based on both some analysis we've done, and I think based on results that come from both JIRA's numbers and HSEO's numbers. And so, a little bit of a quick timeline. I don't want to take too long doing it. January 25 was the HSEO report public release, and really got the discussions going. And I think it'd be fair to characterize most of that discussion was around the assumptions. What were the costs being imposed? What was the timing of the projects? What other uncertainties were there around that? But it was kind of discussion in the back. It didn't get real active. In October of 25, when the JIRA Hawaii agreement was signed, I think things really accelerated and there was a lot more discussion. But again, the results showed cost benefits. There were quotes about how much ratepayers were going to save. And the discussion was around, how do those assumptions impact those conclusions and where do they sit? In January of 26, the Hawaii Energy Policy Forum, chaired by Jenny, she's getting, a lot of practical experience doing these kinds of things, held some discussions, and LNG was one of the topics. And again, a lot of focus around, what were the policy issues, what were the assumptions going into this, but it was a fairly high-level discussion, didn't get real specific. March 12, there was really an incremental change in the way things happened. That was Dr. Matthias Ripp, an ex-professor from the university, identified a programming error in the Excel spreadsheet, something HNI had not seen previously, that resulted in an overestimate of the value of LNG by a significant amount. Coincidentally, and maybe fortuitously, there was a second mistake of just a cell carried over wrong that resulted in a similar magnitude error, but in the opposite direction. So HNI during this time was running its own models and developing it. We didn't have the HSEO spreadsheet, but our numbers were in reasonable agreement if we went down that same assumption path. So there wasn't a lot of reason to question those numbers until that came out. We did our own evaluation at the request of Representative Lowen. We submitted those results to Representative, also to HSEO. And as people know, HSEO came out last week, I think it was, with a revised report and a new set of calculations. I really expected to be sitting here today showing you some pretty slides, what the impact of some of these assumptions would be. But in looking at these in more detail, one of the things we kept hitting is we were coming up with similar net present value, similar annual savings, similar numbers. If we had the same assumptions, we could make different assumptions, get different results. But we weren't coming up with the same rate savings to the ratepayers, and we were confused by that. And we dug into that pretty heavily just in the last week. And, like I said, although our assumptions agree in terms of net present value and savings, I just say it real bluntly here, both the HSEO report and the JIRA PowerPoint from March 17th overstate the potential ratepayer savings. And it has to do with how you assign, I think it's approximately $170 million per year from JIRA, about $85 million a year based on the scenario that's the prime scenario for State Energy Office. Doesn't mean this is all bad for LNG yet, but these double-digit savings messages are being heard, they're being repeated, you've seen it in the press, and just last week after the event in Honolulu that was referred to, Senator Wakai came out on his LinkedIn, and this is not meant to be a criticism of Senator Wakai, but it's the most recent reference I could find. He said LNG should be part of Hawaii's energy mix. Today, JIRA showed how it plans to invest $2 billion to produce power and drop energy costs by 20%. So that is my concern, is that we're looking at this. Affordability is important, but we're addressing it and not quite being as accurate as we might be of what those net savings would be. I think if you look at JIRA's report, and particularly the PowerPoint, it was a little more vague actually in today's, but they claim a 20% cost savings for the cost of production. That's very different than for the total cost. You know, this is a little thought exercise, and I'm not going to go through it. But if we look at today's system at kind of the same dollars per million BTUs for LSFO that is in the models that is being used by both us and HSEO, and you look at the inefficient turbines that we are currently using, fuel counts for about 9 cents, or about a little over 20% of the total bill. So if the LNG was free, and if the infrastructure didn't cost anything, we basically could save 20% on our rate. And clearly that's not true. So it's somewhere less than 20%, and the question is where is it, and how do we take advantage of that, and what can it do for us? So in looking at our analysis and HSEO's, there's a lot of similarities. We both use various grid models to assess LNG usage. We import those into some spreadsheets. HSEO's is available on their website now. We will post ours after this meeting. And those can then be used to look at different assumptions of capital costs, start of commercial operations, fuel costs. Excuse me. A couple of differences. We use full Plexos models to evaluate a wide range of scenarios, including options for repowering oil, which the HSEO report refers to and says there's going to be a cost associated with that, and that is very valid and very true. But we put those scenarios together so people can make those comparisons of what if we repowered and did higher efficiency oil as well. The other thing we've kind of heard, we really don't know what the post-2045 fuel is, so we basically eliminate that from the discussion and say if we repower oil, we repower LNG, come 2045 we're going to have to select the best fuel and go with it from what we have. So we kind of run our models, and we have these 74 scenarios, and we can generate dozens and dozens of graphs. But I'm going to make couple quick comparisons in I think I have final 3 minutes. So I basically look at 5 scenarios. One is no action. This is basically assuming we continue to run the current generators on low sulfur fuel oil. Excuse me. It is the option that is basically being used to compare the savings and or cost of LNG to in the HSEO report. The third option scenario we're looking at is what I call the LNG HSEO assumptions upside. Sorry, Eric, but you know, I had to distinguish between those and our less conservative or less aggressive assumptions we call downside, which is basically putting the assumptions in the HSEO report and what we've seen reported from JIRA into our models. We ran 2 other cases. One is, and we don't believe that we're going to continue, if we stay on oil, to run our oil plants without repowering or building some new power plants. So we at least built some amount of that in, and it's roughly aligned with HECO's Plan 3, about 350 megawatts of new combustion turbine, and then another increment in 2040. And then we looked at what we called LNG conservative or downside. What if it was delayed a number of years, and we said to 2035. We said, what if there was a cost overrun? And we did not do a cost overrun on the entire approximate $2 billion investment, because a big piece of that is the repowering, and that is on both sides. So he said, what if there's a cost overrun associated just with the LNG elements? And then we also had LNG costs in there a little bit. And from that, we generated a couple of charts. One was on the no action basis, kind of what the net present value of operating the grid, looking basically at the capital cost and fuel cost, and came up with a number over the next 15 years. We looked at the LNG upside, and it's relatively small number, but that's because you're comparing against something where there's no investment on the oil side. And then we looked at the LNG downside, and it was a relatively higher potential cost. But contrary to this double-digit savings, even with that a cost overrun, which is larger than we've seen on the cost overruns or savings, that was less than 2 cents per kilowatt hour when you spread it over all of the sales of the utility. But we don't think this is really a very good comparison. we think at the very least you got to do some repower of the oil and compare that. So the next slide, I went one too far. The next slide has an additional cost on the oil scenario because of the capital cost associated with the repower, but we went relatively conservative, assumed a combustion turbine. The LNG upside is the same assumptions that were there before, and we find that the net present value savings is now some $730 million. That's actually a bigger number than the prime case that HSAO is using in their revised report. I think it's something around $650 million. So our numbers are actually showing an increased saving when we do the comparison that way. And the potential cost, excess cost or higher cost, is lower than in that previous case. You're comparing it against a higher base case there. What's significant is, again, if we take those numbers, and so the $730 million corresponds to about $80 million a year annual savings. That's about half of what JIRA's model is doing, but it's consistent or right on where HSEO is. That corresponds to about a 1 cent per kilowatt savings or a 1 cent per kilowatt higher energy. It's not a big play, even with a significant variation in what the proposed assumptions might be. So kind of my takeaway is we need to refocus discussion, not on cost. I mean, it looks like it's basically in parity cost-wise, whether you have very aggressive assumptions or you relax them quite a bit. I think somebody from HECO said that's kind of in the noise of our estimates. And really kind of look at LNG from a what else can it do or what else can it do. And my last slide is kind of a list of things, you know, would it have impact on refineries? Would it have an impact on neighbor islands? Does it enhance reliability? Does it enhance resilience? I think the cost issue is not as big as we're hearing, and I think we need to get more focus on policy and secondary impacts. And that is my talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick. I appreciate your comments. Evaluating assumptions, timelines included in that analysis, really helpful to get that perspective of a really minimal savings or cost to ratepayers at a penny per kWh. So thank you for that. And Nicole, I'd love to have your comments, thoughts on this issue. Thank you.
All right, thank you. And hopefully we'll spice things up a bit. No, that was actually really interesting. And I'll try to keep this brief so we have a lot of time for questions, but thank you all for being here. Over the past several months in my role as chair of the Committee on Energy, Environmental Protection, I've made efforts to understand more about this LNG proposal. Since the initial study by the Energy Office was first released, it was broadly criticized in some circles and broadly socialized in others, and we wanted to better understand it. And so through informational briefings, bill hearings, and testimony during this last session, we heard from many people about this proposal. And after listening and learning, I do have serious concerns. And what troubles me most is not necessarily the proposal itself. I absolutely agree with the Energy Office when they say that if there are ways to improve affordability and reliability, all proposals should be considered. What I've been increasingly concerned with is the process and analysis surrounding this LNG proposal. The Hawaii State Energy Office is supposed to serve the public interest and fulfill a legislative and statutory mandate to objectively guide Hawaii's transition to renewable energy. However, what I've observed over this past legislative session is an office that has put more effort into pushing not only consideration of LNG, but a single for-profit company than I have seen the current leadership put into anything else within their statutory mandates. Their claims about the benefits of LNG hinge on several very shaky, if not outright unrealistic assumptions, and I think Rick kind of touched on this, and in his analysis he takes those assumptions at face value so that your analysis is apples to apples with HSEO's, but I think that discussion of some of those assumptions is worth considering. We do see modeling that artificially limits comparison to oil versus gas and does not meaningfully evaluate other viable pathways. And we're essentially being asked to believe that fuel costs in one of the most fuel price sensitive states in the nation somehow do not really matter that much because gas will always be cheaper than oil. We are also asked to accept the assumption that this gas would not replace or crowd out renewables, another assumption that has been broadly challenged. And I know, that was touched on earlier, and I think, for the reason that it has been a really hot topic of discussion. And I think there are really real concerns that it would have, divert attention and resources away from us pushing on aggressively deploying renewables, especially in the short term, and then in terms of crowding them out of the market, that would be something we would see likely more in the out years. So when several major spreadsheet errors were identified in the Energy Office's original alternative fuel studies, they first denied and then acknowledged those while asserting that all their conclusions remain sound. And now they've released a new version of the study that pivots to a scenario that was previously rejected and continues to assert many of those assumptions that have been broadly challenged. What I have observed from the Energy Office at every turn is what seems to be a concerted effort to make a predetermined outcome appear justified. And their analysis has also given very little attention to another very plausible alternative, more aggressive adoption of renewable energy, which could bring equal or greater savings while also protecting Hawaii's customers from volatile fossil fuel price spikes, increase our energy security and independence, and help us achieve our renewable energy goals more quickly. It's true that solar costs are high in the US right now, a condition influenced in large part by Trump's economic policies. But it's also true that costs have continued to drop globally, especially for battery storage, while technology continues to improve. Renewable energy met all new demand growth globally in 2025. We see many examples of other nations and other jurisdictions within the US that recognize the savings that come from cheap renewable energy. We see them implementing innovative programs that maximize the use of renewables and distributed energy, even during those hours when the sun doesn't shine. Every analysis that I have seen continues to show that expanding local renewable energy, especially solar paired with storage, offers the clearest path towards long-term affordability. I don't think even the Energy Office would necessarily disagree with that. They would just argue that the build-out of solar on Oahu is infeasible. It's like giving up before we've even tried. Claims of savings from JERA and the Energy Office have been and continue to be out of step with what we have seen from independent analysts, from HECO's own assessments, from researchers at HNEI, from UH economics professors, and from other energy experts. These independent analyses do not arrive at the same conclusions about the purported benefits of LNG. And despite this uncertainty, the Energy Office has dedicated substantial resources to socializing this proposal on the basis of these much disputed savings in a way that can only be described as a coordinated public relations campaign. So the obvious question becomes, whose analysis do we trust? The for-profit company that is doing its job to look out for shareholders, an Energy Office that appears to not be objective and has been promoting one single company, absent any competition, or the growing body of independent analysis pointing us in a different direction. I also want to be clear that this discussion is not about ideology or climate activism, and those who have been critical of this LNG plan are not all the environmentalists, as proponents would like everyone to believe. Rick Rocheleau over here is not Greta Thunberg, and I think...
But we love him.
That made me lose my place. Yeah. Sorry, guys. Sorry, my iPad is not cooperating. So Rick is not Greta Thunberg. I added that in, and neither are the very many reputable professionals and academics who've looked at this. And speaking for myself, my primary concerns are affordability, resilience, and energy independence. This is about delivering the most affordable energy available to Hawaii's families and businesses, protecting people from fuel price volatility, such as we are experiencing right now, and from over-reliance on imports, and ensuring that our islands have a stable and reliable energy future. If the state devoted a fraction of the energy, urgency, and institutional support towards accelerating renewables that I've seen devoted towards advancing LNG, we would already be further along, and we would already be saving money. Instead, they continue to pour energy into sort of trotting around this report to all kinds of circles. and promoting a single for-profit company with no ties to Hawaii's political circles while they do nothing to encourage competition. Is that good for the people of Hawaii? Is that putting us in a position where HECO will negotiate the best deal possible if something does move forward? I think these are questions we have to be asking. And in closing, I do recognize that Hawaii's energy transition will not be easy. New things never are, and change never is. But our responsibility is not to cling to old ways because they are familiar, or to fear innovation or run from challenges. It's not to let campaign donors or foreign governments or Donald Trump and his administration decide our energy future. Our responsibility is to work for the good of the people of Hawaii. And so, although I don't love being in the position of raising these uncomfortable questions, and I already apologize to Stephen in advance, it's too important not to. So thank you for having me here, and I look forward to audience questions.
We are so grateful for your perspective and for you taking the time. I know it's incredibly busy right now, but your priorities are consistent with so many of us sitting in this room, just in terms of reliability and affordability and resilience. And those are issues that do come up, and how we get to them, part of this conversation today is this is one of the alternatives or options that we have on the table that it is time for us to evaluate. It is something that is our administrative team, the governor, has made clear that this is something of a priority. And so we are here to have this discussion. And one of the things that I've noted, and want to bring up in light of this is, how should we approach transparency and stakeholder conversation and engagement around a project like this, around LNG, as we move forward? What should that look like? Because what we've had so far hasn't really been much. Anyone?
Reverse order, maybe? I don't know.
Sure. Yeah. Nicole, you want to start?
I mean, I think we have a challenge if our lead agency on these issues doesn't seem to be objective. And yeah, again, I don't feel good saying that. I don't think anyone feels good hearing it. But that does create an issue. I mean, I think I can say what I've done personally, and that is to try to bring light to these issues and try to hold some informational briefings that include a variety of perspectives and that we haven't heard from in the conversation to date, and to just try to continue to elevate people's awareness of what's going on so that we are asking those questions.
Thank you.
I guess, my bottom line is I think it could be a lot better. HNEI has been doing the grid modeling, been assessing reliability, been looking at grid options for a number of years, part of the IGP, part of independent analysis for the PUC. We were not engaged at all during the development of this report until a couple of weeks before it was released. And since that time, it's been relatively intermittent. So I think there's an opportunity. I mean, as you said, I'm not Greta Thunberg. I'm not here to diss LNG. But I think we need to have a much more honest and open discussion with lots of players to assess and decide what's good and what's bad and what the benefits are of the LNG. And I don't think it's been there yet.
I'll add that I think there's some legal process that's been established through statute around how projects like this get formally proposed and vetted, and public due process protections around that. And I look forward to the time during which the PUC champions that and leads us through the formal aspects of those discussions. Up until now, it's been the way that a normal project would go. Like, there is the gondola you can't kill a gondola on Oahu until it's formally proposed, but you can talk about it. So we've been talking about it in the same way that any other proposed investment would be discussed. And I definitely don't feel that there's been any dishonesty in the process so far, and I hopefully other people don't feel that way. But would love to hear with some specificity where that perception of dishonesty would come from, and hopefully we can address that in the future. But yeah, again, I think we're looking forward to the formal due process elements of the PUC process, and I'll turn it over to Eric.
I think that's an interesting question, and I'm certainly not the most qualified to talk about, the internal, workings of the government here and the roles of the agencies. Transparency is super important, right? These are big investments, and they have big implications, right? And so I think in a world where, the next 10 years are going to look very different than the last 10 for various reasons, making sure that any decision like this is overseen and interrogated the right way is absolutely necessary. So I think we support that. I think we've been super pleased with many people in the state are open-minded that want to engage in the dialogue. And I think that we would continue to encourage that and answer questions, share information, and ultimately follow, the state legislative mandated process for a big infrastructure project like this.
Great, thank you. I have another one because I kept coming up, actually, I was listening to you all, about basically thinking about renewables and the inability, it's been stated, that LNG, if this is possible, will help integrate renewables onto the grid. And it can do it in a way that's efficient and improves reliability. So I'd love to hear a little bit from the panelists on that. I know Rick and Jara might have some thoughts, if you want to.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to share our experience on this, and I think we had actually an interesting, this panel met a few times ahead of this and talked about how we would frame this session and got into different discussions. And I think, the need for baseload power, I think, is in operating a grid like the Oahu grid is well, any grid in some sense is quite important, right? So I don't think there's any disagreement that baseload power is going to be part of the mix going forward. And how you do that and the choices around that have a lot of implications. Today, baseload power, we all know it's done by old power plants. Kudos to the HECO team that keeps those plants running. I mean, I think that they themselves know that the sell-by date on many of these facilities is long past. And so, but what we've experienced in Japan, we see here, and some other places in the US where we have old power plants, is that they're not really conducive to a variable dynamic grid. And these are, I think, well understood facts. So the question becomes, how do you solve that? Do you build new power plants that can follow the grid better and react, so that as the well understood intermittency of renewables can be managed? Do you install batteries to try and help create energy storage that allows to flatten some of those spikes out? Or do you curtail, right? Which is what happens in a lot of cases when the base load is not established. So what we have seen in Japan and what we have seen in many other places around the world is that gas-fired power has been very effective at being a complement to renewables. Many of the places that have specifically introduced LNG and transitioned away from oil have seen continued growth of renewables in those markets, and a lot of that has been enabled by the fact that they were able to upgrade and modernize equipment. So do you necessarily need to move to a gas field to do that? I think that's you can get that type of capability still burning oil. But today, practically speaking, with the choices that are in front of us, if you don't want to burn gas, then you're choosing to burn oil. And maybe someday that's not the case, right? Hopefully someday there's an alternative there that's affordable that actually can be in the mix. But today, if we're actually realistic about it, if you don't want to use LNG, then you will continue to use oil until hopefully something else emerges in the future.
I'm going to add in Hawaii's grid a decade ago, and probably not even that long ago, it might be 6 or 7 years ago, when we didn't have battery storage and we were saturating the daytime grid and we had to load follow. Those issues were critically important. And HECO did a lot of work to, even on their old, as much as they could, to make their systems a little bit more nimble. Steam units are not so nimble. But but given the mix that we have, and given that there will be some amount of repowering, and that there are a lot of batteries going on, you said batteries could do it, but batteries can do a lot more than smooth the spike. They can smooth the spike, they can arbitrage energy to the evening. If you look at the discharge of the current PV system with batteries, I think most of that occurs in the night and the evening. So I don't think LNG would hinder the transition, but I think the applications and the responsiveness of the LNG units that were so important a decade ago don't really apply currently to Hawaii's grid. And again, I don't think having those nimble plants certainly doesn't do anything, but given the thrust, if the PV goes in now, it will need to go in with batteries, and those batteries offer a lot of response. It can take care of a lot of those issues.
I'll just add quickly, it sort of depends on what the batteries can do a lot, and they're incredible, and I'm glad to have some in my house and in my car. It's really fantastic. I think it just depends on, it comes down to what's going into the battery. The battery doesn't make its own electricity. You put electricity into it and get it back out. So you have got to generate the electricity from something in order to fill the battery and use it. And there's it's just a question of what's going into the battery. And then, Rick, I also want to give a shout out to your work from, I think it was 2012, maybe 2013, funded by the Office of Electricity of the U.S. Department of Energy and in partnership with GE, where Derek was at the time, looking at the beneficial impact of new power turbines on renewable integration. It's a really good pair of studies from that time period.
And I think that report quotes a fairly high value to LNG if that had happened a decade ago. Comment.
Anything?
Well, I mean, as Rick already mentioned, I think the battery technology is improving and getting cheaper. I think primarily the energy charging those batteries, if we had that scenario here, would be solar. And as an alternative, it could be coming from other sources in times of need. I think the bigger concern, as I mentioned, was the out years, because until there's an actual agreement and an actual proposal in front of HECO, we don't really know what the quote-unquote proposal is. But presumably the numbers have to work for JIRA, right? Not here doing charity in Hawaii. And for that amount of the amount of LNG, you would imagine that there would have to be some agreement to offtake. There, I think, would continue to be a concern whether, especially in the out years, that would crowd out renewable energy. Or you could use renewable energy, but you would still be paying for the LNG, presumably. So, I think that is part of the concern.
That's great. So I have a question from the audience, and this is asking how much the port infrastructure and any other infrastructure for LNG, how much is it, and who is expected to pay? Go ahead, Eric.
Missed the first part of that question. How much support infrastructure?
How much is the port infrastructure
The port
and
infrastructure.
other infrastructure for LNG, and who's expected to pay?
Yeah, so, okay, no, good question. And so when we evaluated the options, right, and what is the right way, well, let's start with our evaluation options was much broader than just LNG, and that's part of what JERA does in any new market that it looks at, because we do invest in all sorts of things. We would, in many places, it's not exactly LNG solution, it's different. But when we came to Hawaii and we looked at, and we paid for a lot of modeling to get done by, some experts that had a lot of experience here to look at the battery biofuel kind of pathway, the hydrogen pathway, or a gas transition pathway. We compared all those pathways and ultimately settled that the lowest carbon, the lowest cost, and the most technically feasible was a gas transition pathway. The next question was, how do you do it, right? And what kind of kit do you put in? In Japan, we operate a number of LNG terminals. The market's a little different there. The volume is different. The choice is different. For Hawaii, some of the real important considerations we had for that, it was around how does this fit within this constraints and the flexibility that we're looking for. And fortunately, over the last 20 years, the advent of the Floating Storage and Regasification Unit, or FSRU, which you'll hear about, has gone from a novel concept to now a proven solution that is used all over the world. In Europe, it you know, kind of saved the day after the Ukraine crisis and Russian gas got shut off. And the beauty of those solutions is that the fixed infrastructure that comes with an FSRU supply chain is much, much less than the historical traditional import facility where you build new ports and jetties and tanks. So that's what we've proposed here, because we think it fits well from a standpoint of cost, size of market, but also fungibility in the future. If as Representative Lowen's pointing out, you know, things change and we aren't dependent on oil, and there's a transformation in the cost and the options that are available to us, then that infrastructure is quite flexible. We estimate about $500 million for the LNG-related investment. And we would anticipate that that would get bundled into the cost of the energy on some part of the chain. And so it can be done in a shorter time period. It can be stretched out over a time period. And I think any assumptions we have made when we're modeling that have that infrastructure being more or less, you know, fully amortized by the time 2045 rolls around. Now, that's all theoretical, academic, because I think the point you're making, which is very good, where are we at 10 years from now? And I think that was one of the points that got brought up 10 years ago when this was brought. And I think that question is one where, you know, we can now see what was missed out on for the last 10 years. Where are we going to be in 10 years is another question. Do we want to be in a spot where we're missing out on that benefit?
Thank you. And I'm sorry I can't give everyone a chance to make their last comments, so I apologize to my panel members, but can we please give the panelists a round of applause? Thank you all so much.